Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pear Fair. I am so excited that you're here, and I'm so excited to be presenting to you Smooth Sailing for the 2021-2022 school year, Calming the Waves After the Chaos. So I want to preface this presentation by saying that I do not have all the answers. I mostly just have a lot of questions and some recommendations. So before we get into any of that, I just want to introduce myself. I am Dani Kennis. I live in New Jersey, but I teach in the suburbs of New York, and I teach high school social studies special ed. I am a wife. I am a mom of 2 toddlers. I'm a foodie. I'm a workout fiend, a traveler, a bookworm, an introvert, and a Swiftie, as in I love Taylor Swift. I am currently reading Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas, and it is phenomenal. And I'm currently listening to the podcast called The Daily. Up at the top, you'll see 3 different icons that will link you to ways to reach out to me on Instagram, on email, and Twitter. Please reach out to me just to say hi, to ask a question, to chat, connect, whatever. I love connecting, so please don't be afraid to click on those buttons and say hi. This presentation was inspired by how I was feeling on the last days of school this year, which you can tell from the GIF was not so great. I felt relief and excitement because it was the end of the year, but more than anything, I really felt this overwhelming anxiety. I felt like there was this looming question mark hanging over my head about next year. We had survived 2 years of pandemic teaching, and now we're headed back in the fall, and things are as close to normal as they've been in 2 years, but how do we address that? Do we just ignore it and act like everything is normal? To me, that doesn't feel genuine, and it doesn't address the glaringly obvious fact that things might feel different and awkward for students and teachers. And then there's the question of what is there to even address? So on the very last day of school, 2 of my colleagues and I were sitting around talking about this, and we made a list of everything that we were concerned about for the following year and the so-called growing pains that specifically our freshman students might have in stepping into the building for the very first time ever. Things like routines and expectations that they've been out of touch with for 2 years. And whenever I'm feeling anxious personally, or I can't get something off of my mind, I have to speak it into the universe and into existence and make it tangible. So we came up with this list that you're looking at right here. And then I took it to Instagram and I crowdsourced the question and reached out to my awesome followers and I asked them the same thing. Overwhelmingly, most of us, 87% to be exact, or 123 people, definitely have concerns about next year. And a lot of your concerns had mirrored the concerns of my colleagues and I. So here are some of the things that we're concerned about: being in person 5 days a week, adjusting to routines and expectations of in-person learning, student socialization and interaction, managing mental health concerns and responding to trauma, rigor and engagement, plagiarism, phone dependence, health concerns. Some of this is within our control and some of it is absolutely not. And I don't share these things to overwhelm you at all or to induce anxiety, but really just to lay it all out on the table and say that we've got a lot of work to do, but within that work, none of us, are in this alone. We will figure it out together, just like we got through pandemic teaching together. The next question I asked, which were people more concerned about? Academics, SEL, social emotional learning, or both equally? Take a look at these numbers. Most people said both equally, but SEL came in not far behind, which we're going to circle back to in a second. But before we go on, I want to address something that is super obvious to me. As this past year kind of crept by, I saw this new catchphrase across social media platforms. While in March and April of 2020, educators were seen as essential workers and heroes, suddenly a year later, we were the reason for this shiny new catchphrase called learning loss. My personal issue with this phrase is that it really severely undervalues the hard work and emotional and mental energy that we spent trying to build engaging lessons and connections with our kids, some of whom we were never able to meet in person. We were thrown into this really messy situation that was so unexpected, and we just rolled with it. So in talking to a few educator friends a couple of weeks ago, I heard my friend Stacy call it learning gaps instead of learning loss, and that just felt a little bit less weird to me, or a little bit less uncomfortable. And I just want to be clear, learning happened. It just looked very different from traditional schooling. I'd even argue that learning happened in more profound ways than during pre-pandemic education. I want to reinforce that we all absolutely crushed the past 2 years. We put our students first, we prioritized their mental health, we prioritized our own mental health, and most importantly, we taught our students really, really important soft skills that employers are looking for. Isn't that the goal of teaching, right? To make our students ready for the world, prepare them for the world whenever they get out of school. So, skills that are typically overlooked like this or tricky to teach in a traditional classroom setting are skills that we focused on this year. They're skills that they'll need when they go into the workforce. So, these are things like self motivation and resilience. While some students may have initially chosen to join class in pajamas from their bed in the dark with their dog right next to them, many of them eventually realized that a more professional learning environment was more conducive to productivity. They also learn time management. It is so easy to ignore an alarm clock when you only have to walk to the next room and roll out of bed to attend class. Being in class on time and attending to the lesson for a full 45 minutes or however long your class periods are, participating and being a strong self advocate are all skills that I know many of my students personally really struggled with pre pandemic, but these are skills that flourished over the past 2 years. Next is tech literacy. Without a doubt, the ability of my students to access and organize and use tech tools like Google Drive and Classroom, Quizlet and Gimkit and Kahoot have improved tenfold. Even for myself and my colleagues, we were forced to learn tools and extensions and programs that we never needed to know before. And then finally is communication. This was huge in my classroom. It was so important for me that my students were well versed and highly skilled in communicating and advocating for themselves. We focused on the right way to send emails, and I also found that using an app like Remind was a game changer in teaching my kids how to reach out to me for help. So I definitely appreciate that there are certainly gaps in knowledge, but I don't think any of it is so severe that it can't be corrected or overcome in time. We need to remain adaptive and open to new approaches and deeply focused, most of all, on student engagement and building relationships. My final question in my Instagram poll was whether or not people would approach next school year differently because of the past 2 years. 129 people, or 93%, said yes. And when I asked what they would do differently, 99% of respondents said that they would focus on SEL and community. So those are things like building relationships, connections, conversations, slowing down, being flexible. And when I read all this, I felt so much pride in belonging to a profession where my colleagues from around the world so deeply believe in the importance of acknowledging our students as humans, as people. When I read through those answers, it felt like a full circle moment because I started off last year feeling clueless and scared. So I focused on what I knew, which was relationships. And going into this next school year, I plan to do the exact same thing, starting with this beautiful sketch from Sylvia Duckworth about this awesome TED Talk called Every Child Needs a Champion. I link it at the very top of my syllabus every year, and we watch it and talk about it. And it really sets the tone for a clean slate and this sense of each student having a never wavering cheerleader for the entire year. So we've talked a lot about problems and concerns and some feelings, but I want to get to solutions. So I'm starting again this same school year the way that I focused on last school year, which is focusing exclusively on SEL and building relationships. Last year at Pear Fair, I talked about the importance of building connections, and now, partly thanks to the pandemic, just about every educator I've spoken to truly understands the importance of SEL. But we need to kind of talk about what that looks like in action and how do we focus on empathy and building relationships in a really concrete way. So I'm going to give you a bunch of ideas that you can use in your classroom starting on day one when you go back to school. The first of these is SEL check-ins, and they can come in a lot of different forms. You can do them daily or weekly. I'm going to give you some super simple examples of both, and then we'll get a bit more complex. My school personally uses the Yale Ruler SEL program, and I use bits and pieces of it, and then I kind of adapt to the needs of my classes and each of my different students. So one way of checking in with students is to use what you're looking at, which is called the mood meter. It's basically a tool for getting a pulse on the mood and the energy of your students. And the idea is that once you know the mood of the class, you can pivot or differentiate. So, for example, if you have a lecture plan and your students are feeling super high energy, maybe doing a more active lesson where they can move to the four corners of the room to show their stance on a particular issue might be a way to better engage them during that particular class period. Mood meters can come in all different shapes and sizes, from the color-based one that you just saw to ones that have specific words or phrases to really help expand students' emotional vocabulary. Or here's one of my favorites, this really cool Mean Girls one with all these different GIFs. And if you actually click on each of these images over the past 2 slides, they will bring you to a forced copy of slides that you can use with pre-made mood meters. Next is a really low stakes way, again, to connect with students, which is through an attendance question. This was the most fun thing in the whole world for the whole year. And you do this at the beginning of every single class. So you ask a really simple, non-content related question that students weigh in on with either a thumbs up, thumbs down, by raising their hand, writing their answer on a traditional Post-it note, or they can vote on Google Classroom. You can also just old school talk it out. So this image that you're looking at, Scroll Your Roll, is an activity that I do every Monday with my kids where I have them scroll through their camera roll on their phones. And if they don't have a phone, they drop a link last year in our Meet chat to a picture that they Googled. So their picture, whether Googled or on their phone, needed to show what they did over the weekend. And oftentimes with the pictures came really awesome and funny stories. It was such a great way to learn about what my kids were interested in and the things that made their eyes light up and how they spent their free time, which gave me a lot of insight into who they were. So attendance questions are really helpful for the obvious reason of tracking who is and who isn't present in class. But most importantly, it serves as a talking point for your students. It gives them an opportunity to connect with each other and with you. It gives you an opportunity to hear each voice in a really low risk situation. I've seen more of students' personalities come through by using these attendance questions than with anything else I've ever done in my class. So here are a couple of them, and they're usually just silly. So would you rather have antlers or elephant tusks? How do you feel on a squirrel scale today? How do you feel on a bear scale today? This is one of my favorites. Serious debate, where does a tie belong on the neck of a dinosaur? Paper towel roll, under or over. And if you really, really, really want to get kids going and really worked up, you have to ask this question. Is a hot dog a sandwich? My kids went insane for this. They absolutely loved it. And it kind of became this like argument piece and an inside joke for the rest of the school year. Another simple way to dip your toes into the water of social emotional learning is by focusing on mindfulness. I want to share 2 of my favorite mindfulness techniques, one of which you're listening to right now. So one is a bit more passive, which just involves students doing independent work or possibly doing breath work to the sound of this, the crackling fireplace video from YouTube. The other is more active, and it's called color mindfulness. So I project this image onto the board and read through the directions as students focus on a color and think of as many items that are that color. It gives them a brain break and allows them to really refocus their thoughts and energy and attention so that we can then return to the task at hand with a clear mind and with fresh eyes. All right, so now we're ready to get into the nitty gritty of really explicit, targeted, mushy gushy, feelingsy kind of stuff. So this past year, every single Friday, we called it Catch Up Friday. I gave my students the entire period, so 45 minutes, to just breathe, exhale, catch up. I really wanted them to push themselves to reflect on their week and think about what they needed to go into the weekend and come back to school on Monday feeling recharged and ready to go. Because distance learning, whether you are at home or online, the combination is exhausting. So it was really important for me to help them get in touch with some way to decompress. So sometimes I gave them an opportunity to make up work or catch up on an assignment that they didn't like their grade on, but almost every single week, the period was spent doing some kind of a formal SEL check-in and then conversing through either private comments or the Remind app or in person for the few in-person students that I had. Questions on these SEL check-ins varied from week to week. We had themes like self-advocacy or confidence or self-care, and other times the reflections were just more generalized and asked how their week went and how they're doing. I did the SEL check-ins in a lot of different formats that I'll walk you through now. So we used Google Docs, Google Forms, we used interactive Google Slides, but I've got to say, obviously, the real MVP of check-ins was Pear Deck, especially for giving feedback to students and leaving them comments, which was so quick and so seamless. So you can see in some of the check-ins that I asked them to focus on a point of pride that they felt both academically proud of, academically and personally. And I just want to add that separating the personal and academic like this was really important to me because it forced students to consider themselves as more than just students. I wanted them to know that I recognize that they're teenagers with struggles and feelings outside of just my social studies class. I want to focus on that idea of feedback that I mentioned briefly. So that was my favorite part of these check-ins. As the kids were doing them, I left them comments or sent them text messages to remind to start conversations or just to check in with them on some of the things that they were writing about. To go back to this slide, one of my favorite activities was this awesome Teacher Appreciation Week, where students identified and then wrote emails to a past teacher that made an impact on their life. So we focused on developing common emotional vocabulary to help identify and put words to the things that they were feeling. And then we targeted how to address some of those really ugly feelings occasionally that might come up. It wasn't always negative, though, which is why I want to bring us back to the Teacher Appreciation email, which was so nice for the teachers to see. I sent the emails out to them and they received them, and all of them wrote back with, I needed this. This was amazing. So I highly recommend you check out. If you click on this, it will link you to a copy of this that you can have and use with your own students. So back to developing that emotional vocabulary. I really encourage my students to identify how they were feeling. So I gave them some examples of words like you can see on the left, and then I gave them actionable steps that they could take for figuring out how to deal with those feelings. Something else that we talked about was personal habits and things that they wanted to start, stop, and continue doing, both academically and personally again. And then something else that they really enjoyed that I thought was super cool, they were so excited about this, but it's so simple, was when I had them find an inspiring, quote or image to make as their home screen or their lock screen just to help them get through some tough times. And they absolutely loved it. Something else I did was at the end of every single check-in was a suggestion box. So I told them to share with me a song, a food, a movie, a podcast, a YouTube channel, a hobby, an app, a website, anything that they were excited about. And then I shared one of my own with them in return, which was a really cool way of getting to know each other. And finally, the last thing I always ask them on every single check-in was, is there anything else you want to share with me? Is there anything else that you'd like me to know? And I left it pretty open-ended. And that kind of brings me to a disclaimer that I just want to throw in, which is that I have a really good relationship with the school counselors and the school psychologists that I work with, which I think is an absolute necessity for doing this kind of work. It's inevitable that if you're doing this right, students are going to open up to you about some really tough and personal and challenging and heavy topics, and that's okay. But you have to be ready and prepared to have access to resources that can help both you and your students through any of those difficult situations. And school counselors and psychologists and any other resources you have in your building are going to be really useful for that. If we've got any Peloton fans here, this Instagram post that I cropped is a quote from Kendall Toole, and I love, love, love how it speaks to the work that goes into SEL. So it says, when we're vulnerable, we can positively impact people. That's when we can make a difference. It can sometimes feel so tricky to be vulnerable in front of your students, especially as maybe a young or first year teacher, especially if you've always been told to be stoic until Christmas, which I tried in my first 5 years or so of teaching, and I've never been more miserable. It was when I started opening up and showing my weirdness and my flaws that my students really started to respond, and they started doing the same in return. So it takes time to knock down those walls and to kind of push through that and get used to being vulnerable and get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So here's another fun and super effective SEL idea. At the end of the school year this year, when everyone was just kind of feeling burnt out and just done, I decided to level up and give Genius Hour a try. I thought about it in the past, but honestly, I was really overwhelmed by it and by the constraints of a typical school year. So this past year, I just went for it. But I didn't call it Genius Hour because it felt a little intimidating to me since I was kind of going rogue and doing my own version of it. So we just called it the History of Project, which then became known as MiniGenius Hour. So before I begin, I just want to give a little quick background on Genius Hour. It's also called moonshot thinking, sometimes called 20% time or passion projects. I'm going to be calling it Genius Hour. So it's this idea that you allow students a determined amount of time, whether one day every week for 2 months or 2 weeks straight, which is how I personally did it, to explore things that they're passionate about. It encourages creativity and it gives students agency in choosing what they learn about. So it started at Google when they had their engineers spend 20% of their work time doing any passion project that they wanted to. And the purpose behind Genius Hour was to increase productivity based on the idea that if you're doing something you love and something that excites you, you're more likely to be invested in it. One of the products that actually was born from Genius Hour is sticky notes or post-it notes, my favorite things in the whole world, hence my stuck on edu handle. If you click on the Genius Hour image here on the slide, it'll actually bring you to a website where you can learn more about the applications of Genius Hour in the classroom, but I'm going to speak to that now. We called it MiniGenius Hour because we adapted the rules, like I said, and kind of just made it work for us. So this whole project spanned across 2 weeks. The last 2 weeks of school, every single day for 2 weeks, we worked on it. And I found that that continuity really helped the engagement and motivation levels of my students. So on the day that I introduced MiniGenius Hour, I shared my general ideas with the students and then let them give feedback to make changes. So together we decided on point values and due dates and the presentation format that we wanted. And I really only had a few non-negotiable rules about Genius Hour. So the first was that they had to create and research 2 open-ended questions about their topic. So I taught them the difference between open and closed-ended questions. Then they needed one of their research sources to be a human that they reached out to via email. And the other one is that their final product or presentation could not be done on Google Slides. I really wanted them to kind of explore out of their comfort zone and learn a new tool. So I focused on these three things because these are the skills that I knew my students needed to work on. It will look different in your class depending on what your students need to work on and what skills you want to focus on with them. But just keep in mind that the parameters will look different for everybody. For me, making sure my students know how to send a properly formatted email was something that was so important to me, and ironically, was the thing that my students really disliked and dreaded the most and had the most anxiety over, which I was really surprised about. So I spent a full class period doing really explicit, direct instruction on how to send an email, and that helped a lot. For the actual MiniGenius Hour project, the topics that they picked and the projects they came up with blew me away. One student chose to research World War II and ended up talking on the phone to a Holocaust survivor and then told us all about it. And it was this like beautiful, amazing, incredible opportunity for her. And we loved hearing about it. And she was so excited about it. Another student's topic was how video game controllers were made. And she drew this awesome drawing on Procreate. We had an old school poster with Hershey bars taped to it. I thought that was really cool because it just felt so old school. Someone else chose to look into her grandpa's role in World War II and drew this awesome picture that explained exactly what he did. And one of the coolest presentations and topics was the Littlest Pet Shop, which I had no idea what that was before I heard about it, before my student presented on this. But the student explored the evolution of how these toys have been gendered and feminized over the lifespan of its existence. And they really looked at it through this really powerful lens of gender and identity. And I thought it was so cool that they really brought something like that to life through this project. So I want to leave you with 2 more really concrete ideas and share what I'm going to be doing on the first 2 days of school. So I'm focusing on student interaction, participation, and really just like good old fun. I also want to focus on face-to-face conversations and staying off of our devices for a full 45-minute period because I have missed that so much. I want my students to feel comfortable in the physical space of my classroom because, again, that's something that they haven't been in for 2 years. So the very first thing I'm going to do is this beach ball of questions that I have. It looks a little different from the image that you're seeing. I left it at school, so I couldn't take a picture of it, but I have this big pink and white beach ball with like 100 questions written on it that I used Sharpie to do. And I made it years ago, and I've had it in my classroom, and I'm super excited to finally use it again. So students stand in a circle, they move the desks to the side, they kind of tap the ball to one another, and wherever their right thumb lands on the ball, that's the question they've got to answer. So they introduce themselves, tell us their names, answer a question, and then hit the ball to someone else. This is really active and fun, and most importantly, it allows everyone to have a chance to be involved and have their voice heard on day one. The next day, I will probably focus a little bit on expectations and the syllabus and some procedures, but not in the traditional, like, boring sit and get way. I'm planning on doing this by giving each student a letter and an envelope. So let me back up a little bit. At the end of last year, I had all of my students write a letter to next year's incoming class of freshmen. And they're going to the current freshman class. They're going to do some reading, some analyzing, and some digging to kind of figure out what some of my expectations might be based on those letters. And they'll also get to learn a little bit about me and my personality. I am toying with the idea of maybe having students write me a letter themselves, but I haven't decided yet. We'll see. I know that our very first real academic assignment will be MiniGenius Hour. So this year, as my kids were presenting their projects to each other, I was floored at how much I learned about them in the last 2 weeks of school. And I thought that I knew them really well before that. But I'm really glad we did it that way because it takes so much courage and, again, vulnerability to share about your passions in front of classmates. So for next year, we're going all in from the start, and we're going to kick off the year with Genius Hour. And I'm hopefully going to use it as a way to get to know my students and kind of assess their writing and their research skills, in addition to getting a feel for their strengths and their areas of need. All right, so it's time for some real talk, super transparency here. I went back and forth on whether or not I should include this slide. I've always felt like really uncomfortable giving myself props for anything, but in order to show how powerful all of these ideas can be, I think that some humble bragging might be in order. So this past year was the first full year that I gave 100% to SEL and put academics and standards aside. Obviously, the climate and culture of the world kind of called for that and allowed me to do that. But in my gut, like deep inside, I just really feel that the kind of authentic and genuine connections I develop with my students doesn't compare to any other year, even with online students. And my efforts were recognized and reinforced this year when I was recognized with a statewide award for Outstanding Innovative Teacher because of the SEL work that I've done. I'm telling you that this works. Don't be afraid to jump in and be vulnerable. It was so rewarding to develop these relationships with my students. And so many of them confided in me about their mental health struggles and identity confusion. And it just felt so nice to be able to help them in a meaningful way and be a ray of sunshine in their day. And I just want to share, this is a text message that you're seeing from one of my colleagues. And then the end of the year survey that I gave to my students. These are two of the things that my students said. And again, it feels very weird to be bragging about this, but I've never gotten this kind of feedback before. And I want the same thing for you. And I know you have it in you to make your students feel the same way. So as we near the end of this presentation, I just wanted to give this reminder. It's never too late to start building and improving relationships, whether you're watching this before the school year starts, during the school year, even in the last week of school. It is really never too late to show a little bit of yourself and share yourself with your students, and they will do the same in return for you. And of course, a reminder that you have totally got this. You can do this. You are the best teacher for your students, and they are so lucky to have you. I truly mean that. If you're sitting here and choosing to watch this on a summer day where you're choosing to learn and collaborate and grow, give yourself so much credit, pat yourself on the back, and forge ahead because, again, you've totally got this. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching and being a part of Pear Fair. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your experience with Pear Fair. Please reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter or through email. Again, I love connecting. Ask a question, say hi. We can troubleshoot together, anything. If you are looking for more of the SEL content, feel free to visit Stuck on Edu, my Instagram, and check out my highlights on SEL. And also, I gave you a tiny URL on the last and the first slide so you can access this presentation. There's a lot to click through, so make sure you check out all of the links. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the summer and an excellent start to your school year. Bye, everyone.